Well, here we are, folks. It is time for us to take a look at the United States in something we call the Great War. But if you haven't caught it by now, I am what they call a cultural historian. And I have this belief that artists have their pulse on something. They're able to perceive things that perhaps the average Joe or Jane on the street can't perceive. So I want to take a look at, just before the Great War, a shift that occurred in the art of the world. So here we have Moulin de la Galette by Renoir, painted in 1876, very famous painting, impressionist painter, tapped in beautiful times in Europe. Light, dapple, dancing, friends, drinking, great time at the cafe. I'd love to be there. Wonderful. Now, this is 1876. Peace had been in Europe since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, which was 1815. So if you do the math, this is several generations of people who have known nothing but peace in Europe. In 1886, Seurat painted a Sunday afternoon on the island of Le Grand Jatte using a technique called pointillism. Again, using a new technique, but what we see to begin to fade away is individualism. These faces of these people are barely recognizable, and the further away that you get, you can't see them. If you go back to the stark contrast, you can pick out individual human beings, individual faces, the moods, the emotions, the carefreeness, the contentedness of the times. You fast forward back to Seurat. It's only 10 years later. Something seems incredibly wrong, even though what he has painted here on the park along the River Seine, what should be a happy, carefree moment, seems, in a sense, somewhat disturbing. And we move forward to Night Cafe by Van Gogh in the south of France. The garish incandescent lights, the odd clock in the center of the room, the pool table with no players, people exhausted, tired. The Vision after the Sermon by Gauguin. French Huguenot women praying after a sermon, having a vision of Gabriel wrestling with the devil. What's with a cow? What I don't get it. But the colors are bizarre. The juxtaposition is different. The faces, again, even the pious one at the left, we won't know who she is. Human identity seems to matter little. The later we go into the 19th century, to the point where human features become somehow hideous or monstrous. Norwegian painter Edvard Munch. Or Kirchner, who drew this painting in Dresden in 1908. Artists have a sense that we might have had peace for nearly 100 years, but all is not okay with the world. These two women that you see here in the center, one with a green face and one without a green face, but a green hand or ghoulish hand, these women actually commissioned Kirchner to help with a painting. They were not happy with the result, but it is considered now a classic. Matisse in 1909. This is Harmony in 1909. Just wanted to get that across. Again, female figure, but who is she? identity is pretty much a mess. Nude Descending from a Staircase by Duchamp in 1913. What is going on? What do the artists see that the normal everyday person does not? I want to bring in the concept of total war. The concept of total war is not new. It's been around for a long time. Historians have gotten around to trying to argue that total war had been around since at least the Civil War. The United States Civil War was a total war, absolutely. But now there's a new strain in history in which we are talking about total war that goes back to the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries. So let's take a closer look at this concept. A French writer by the name of Alphonse Séché in 1915 put out a book called The Wars of Hell. And yes, in 1914, war had broken out in Europe. And Séché, however, had written this book well before it was published and well before the World War I had broken out. And so it's a bit of a prophecy in a sense, in that Séché says that wars will now be mechanized, and that total mobilization of your population, of your entire economy, all of this is necessary in order to fight the new wars of the 20th century. And he described to a T some of the techniques that the Germans would use in the start of World War I and also in World War II. With mass production of goods, of mass production of bullets and the materials to fight, the weapons of war, that not only are you going to be targeting people's armies, but you're going to be targeting civilian populations as well, because the civilian populations make the weapons that the armies and navies use, and therefore they are a legitimate target in the concept of war. Now, this has been around for some time, like I said, back, if we go far back enough. Cesar Gat teaches at I believe the University of Tel Aviv, and he put out a piece in 2010 where he talked about the concept of total war in terms of gunpowder, the printing press, and oceans. And by that, Gat meant that you could not have total war without these three things. The concept of total war definitely involves gunpowder, obviously. But because gunpowder is so deadly that it can project pieces of metal great distances, can cause great harm to buildings at great distances, to fortifications at great distances, can kill hundreds of people from great distances, that the size of armies needed to be bigger. And because the size of armies needed to be bigger, you involved not only more people to be conscripted or drafted into the armies and the navies, but you needed more people to support the people who were in the army and the navy. So you're involving more and more of the population, those that fight and those that support the fighters. Gat also points out that the printing press does a great job at disseminating news. Well, sometimes news, most of the time propaganda. And so no matter what side you are on, you could be a German, you're going to read about the evils of the French. If you're French, you're going to read about the evils of the Germans, and on and on. Oceans come in because oceans mean that you are, as a European power or even an American power, as we found out in the Spanish-American War, to project your power overseas earned you a sort of a significant nod, that they recognized you as a power, and that it took a tremendous amount of support to put people overseas, to put a ship overseas to display your flag, which involved trade, bringing raw materials back to the home country. All of this was necessary, particularly in a country like Japan, where raw materials are in very short supply. The acquisition of oil was all important for Japan in order to keep their war machine going. And the same for Germany. The same for Italy. Gatt says that 100% of all your resources, not just your army and your navy, but all people everywhere within your country, is necessary in order for any nation or country or state to carry out the concept of total war. There is no distinction now between those who fight and those who support the fighters. Combatants, non-combatants, those are just words. Anything is fair game in this concept of total war. This is what we're walking into in the First World War. To further go on with the concept of total war, Stig Forster, also in 2010, talked about that the concept of total war is really a French invention that goes back to Napoleon's time. Napoleon raised an army, and the largest army at his time in 1803, of 600,000 men as they started to storm across Europe. This is at a time where a large army in Europe was considered maybe 10,000. Here he walks up with a force of 600,000. And because of this, Forster writes that as war itself developed into a comprehensive public affair, the dimensions and intensity of warfare grew dramatically. And we're going to see this. Industrial production will create industrialized numbers and scales of death that we have never seen before in the history of mankind. Take a look at some of those casualties. A quarter of all French men born between the years of 1890 and 1895 will die. Estimated that almost 10 million military personnel perished during this war. Approximately 6.8 million civilians will die because of combat-inflicted wounds and battles. The British themselves will lose 1.2 million soldiers and sailors. It's just an incredible number. France will lose 1.7 million. Russia, 3.3 million. Austria, 1.6 million. Germany, 2.5 million. Turkey, 3 million people. Italy, 1.2 million deaths. The United States, in contrast, loses only 117,000, or 0.1 million, 0.11 if you want to, 0.12 if you want to round that up. If we add the influenza outbreak at the end of the war, we're going to add another 38 million people who will die of just the flu. This is a terribly destructive war. Things change. Things change. The world will not be the same. The United States will not be the same. Most, as you saw in the numbers that we just listed, most will die in combat, not disease, unless we throw the flu on there. These are numbers of deaths that we have not seen since 1815. And these are deaths that had occurred since the religious wars, 1518 to 1648. The difference here is the number of people that died over 130 years of fighting in Europe took place in just 4 years. This is a terribly destructive war. In 1518 to 1648, almost a third of the European population perished. We achieved that in the years 1914 to 1918, in just 4 years, we lose a tremendous amount of people. The mind cannot comprehend the number of lives lost. It's just incredible. I want to talk some generalities here because I follow trends, and that's who I am as a historian. There's this thing called the forces of modernity. Things that make you modern. And by the time 1900 rolls around, there's a race to see who could be more modern, particularly in Europe, particularly between two countries, Great Britain on the one hand and Germany on the other. Each will try to outcompete each other to be more modern. What do you mean by that? Forces of modernity. And what we're talking about is the ability to produce materials that you then need to sell in order to keep your economy running. And so we see both in Germany and in the country known as England a push to dominate the world. England had a huge head start. Germany doesn't even become Germany until the year 1871. They were Prussia and then like 100 other little principalities all throughout Germany. The Kingdom of Swabia, Bavaria, Heidelberg, all these different regions had their own independence. Lubeck. In 1871, not only does Germany unify, but each of those itty-bitty little cities that had been their own little principalities had their own universities. By the time Germany unifies in 1871, the forces of modernity begins to kick in, because what we start to see is that Germany now holds hundreds of universities. England, maybe 4 or 5. And what we see is, whereas we had an industrial revolution that spawned first cloth materials, second iron and steel, and then railroads, what you're going to get in the third industrial revolution is something called petrochemicals. You ever hear a guy named Diesel? Invented gasoline. We are going to see some of the best technology in the world coming out of Germany, because it's being funded by these great universities. And this output, this technological output, not only in terms of technology, but in terms of sheer volume of things produced, needs somewhere to go. So controlling of the world comes out of those forces of modernity. Industrialization, the idea of nationalism, the belief that your nation is better than any other nation, and of course that comes from the teachings of Herbert Spencer, who we've already talked about. In England and in America, that meant the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. The problem with that is white Anglo-Saxon is an area in Germany, Saxony. There used to be a kingdom of Saxony. In fact, they invaded England and defeated them a long time ago, thousands of years ago. That's how English come to call themselves Anglo-Saxons. England says they're better people because they have that Saxon blood. But now, in addition to that, 18th century, we had 3 kings. King George I, King George II, both of them born in Germany. King George III was the first grandson of King George II, but at least he was born in England. They all spoke fluent German. In fact, King George I couldn't even speak German at all. And they were all from Hanover, Germany. Hanover was its own kingdom before Prussia took it over and unified Germany in 1871. See what I'm talking about? So it's all intertwined. But social Darwinism says different societies are a little bit better. Our nation's better than your nation. It all led to these romantic notions of a pure, ideal, when your country was the best. So the Germans look back to a point in time prior to Christ, prior to the spread of Christianity in Europe, because the Roman Empire is the only place they could not defeat were the Germans. And so romantics in Germany will point to those good old days which will feed into social Darwinism, which will feed into nationalism, which fed into the industrial might of Germany, which created the forces of modernity. See what I'm saying? But if every country is believing this, the French believe that they're the best. The Italians believe that they're the best. And this has been going on during peacetime. And we're making all these weapons of war during peacetime. 100 years of peace. Well, this industrial might starts to unfold. Sooner or later, someone's going to want to play with those toys. In the United States, while all this is going on, prior to the war breaking out, we have a little fling, a couple of them. One in Haiti and the other in Mexico. So here you see Uncle Sam jumping the fence, chasing the famed Pancho Villa. We send in General Pershing after Pancho Villa attacked a town in New Mexico. The interesting thing is Pershing was never able to catch Pancho Villa, ever. The war broke out and he got recalled, and Pancho Villa lived to fight the revolution in Mexico at the time. And this is what was happening in Mexico. It's been kind of a civil war just before World War I, of which Pancho Villa, or Francisco Villa, was one of the fighters, or one of the major players. Actually, he had a huge army, actually, at one point, and actually occupied Mexico City for months. But his army created some hate and discontent in Mexico City, and he had to leave. But that's another story. Haiti, ladies and gentlemen, we have occupied, our longest military occupation in the history of the United States is in Haiti. We began to occupy Haiti in July of 1915. We do not leave the island until August of 1934. If you want to know why Haiti is the basket case of the Caribbean, this is one of the reasons why. Maybe. It's more complicated than that, actually. One of the reasons we invaded Haiti was instability. It's a stretch of 7 presidents in 5 years, and the latest, who was Guillaume Sam, who in June of 1915 was brutally murdered, dragged from the French embassy in Port-au-Prince, and, well, dismembered piece by piece by a crowd not happy with him. One of the other reasons we go into Haiti with a man by the name of Admiral Bundy with Navy and Marine forces has to do with the inability of Haiti to repay any of its bills. So we seized their customs offices. So anything going into and out of the country beginning in July of 1915, we would control those customs houses. We would make sure that we get our money back, and then anybody else would eventually get their money back as well. Yeah, another reason we also attacked Haiti in 1914 had to do with Germany, because German ships were hanging around in the Caribbean. And most of that had to do with Panama and the canal. And we had just finished completing the Panama Canal in 1914. And this was to the discontent of many European nations. Germany had hoped to be the builder of the canal. They were not. France had actually started the canal. They couldn't finish it. So it would take Teddy Roosevelt in the United States to help Panama build its canal. German destroyers in the area of the Caribbean made us a little nervous. We thought that Germany would try to take Haiti, so we took it. We thought Germany would seize their customs houses. So to put a stop to that, we seized their customs houses. And then we stayed there till August of 1934, and the reason we left in August of 1934 is we couldn't afford to stay there anymore. Lusitania is one of those stories that comes off quite brilliantly in most history textbooks. 11 miles off the coast of Ireland, Almost there. It gets hit and sinks within 18 minutes in a spectacular explosion. Nearly 1,200 people will die, and it took just one torpedo. But there were two explosions. What's going on? What's going on is there were small arms on board the Lusitania. Now, this is a cruise ship, a pleasure cruise ship. This is not a merchant craft. This was not a Navy ship by any stretch of the means. It had people who went on the Lusitania like you would go on the Titanic, like you would go on any particular cruise ship for fun, to have great foods and the bands, that kind of thing. But there were small arms on board, almost 4.5 million rounds, 30-06 type rounds, right? That's what the Germans hit. What's interesting is the Germans put out a advertisement in the New York Times before the Lusitania sailed away from New York City heading to England. And that advertisement, which was purchased by the German government, they had warned people not to sail on the Lusitania. And mostly because Germany had intelligence that the Lusitania was smuggling in small arms. Sure enough, what's interesting is this little poster here to the left. We have a defeat of the Kaiser and his U-boats. Victory depends on which fails first, food or frightfulness. What's interesting is the depiction of this German or Kaiser-looking, well, rat-looking person. He looks like a rat, come on. And he's over there, he's got that submarine, he's kind of hovering over, and in the distance a burning, sinking ship. Public opinion against submarines is horrid, by the way. At this point in time, it's 1915. The United States is not involved in the war whatsoever. But once the Lusitania goes down, public opinion against Germany and against unrestricted submarine warfare grows radically huge. A couple of months after the Lusitania sank, Germany puts out an announcement that it will suspend its operations against sinking ships by submarine. They pull the idea of unrestricted submarine warfare. Again, we talked about this concept of total war. There is no blurring between combatants and non-combatants. There's no such thing. Germany was exercising its rights in the First World War to destroy the means for England to carry on the war. They meaning Germany, had intelligence that the Lusitania had on board not 1,200 or 1,400 people. They had information that on board the Lusitania was 4.2 million rounds of 30 millimeter small rounds. If Germany does not fight and does not take out non-combatants, the United States will continue to feed Great Britain all the war materials it needs. What choice would you make if you were a German leader, knowing that war is of that total war concept? You need the ocean. You need to be able to protect yourself from an empire like Britain. If you can isolate Britain, if you can surround it with U-boats and keep anything from going in or out, you'll win the war. So if they send a cruise ship to England in the middle of a great war, by God, sink that sucker. That's their thinking. That's the concept of total war we're talking about. In the United States, meanwhile, there is a movement to stay out of the war. We've always been, until 1898, when we went to war with Spain, a country that has been rather isolated. We still have notions of our history, of our culture, which has always been to stay out of European conflicts and European wars, unless we ourselves start them. There were anti-imperialists, progressives, news headlines, all of them attempting to convince Americans not to enter this war. Even when the Lusitania sinks, it will take a year and 9 months for the United States to be convinced that they need to go to war. A year and 9 months, almost 2 years after the Lusitania sinks. It's not the Lusitania that makes America go to war. The high command in the United States, they understand the concept of total war. They do. They could understand why Germany did what Germany did. One of the songs that came out during this particular trend was a song that I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier. Sold over 1 million song sheets. That's the song sheet cover over there to the left. So this song was being played in parlors all across the country. It was being played in private homes. You could buy cylinders to this day. You know those little cylinders, little blue cylinders where they etched in the songs. It's a cylinder machine, not a record flat disc, but the round, three-dimensional looking thing. Anyway, this was, if Casey Kasem was alive, this would be in his top 10 of 1915. We have this particular song queued up, and you can listen to it. It is part of our learning module for the week. I definitely want you to take a listen to this song. Quite important. And our secondary document is also about this particular song and its meaning and the context in which it appeared. They talk about this scene here in the very front, where the soldier is being protected or hovered over by this graying mother. And in background, behind them are all these explosions going off. So you're a mom, you read the newspapers. By the time 1916, 2 years have gone into the war, we already know there's over 2 million soldiers that have died in this war. The Battle of Verdun starts in 1916, goes through 1917. 10,000 soldiers will die in the Battle of Verdun in the first 5 minutes of that war. This is how horrific this battle is. And it goes on for 10 months. Some 350,000 British soldiers lose their lives in the Battle of Verdun. And this is what this song is about. The secondary document that's on file, and you can watch, talks about this particular scene that you see on the sheet music itself. The song was parodied. Teddy Roosevelt says, "This is foolish. It's like writing a song, I didn't raise my girl to be a mother. This is what boys do. Boys are raised to be men, and men fight. Girls are raised to be mothers." You can't say this. Parodies of the song, I didn't raise my dog to be a sausage. Because all the craze in 1910 was an invention called the hot dog. Right? Before 1910, no hot dogs. After 1910, hot dogs. I didn't raise my dog to be a sausage. Funny. There's a strong anti-war movement in this country. President Woodrow Wilson will run for re-election in 1916, and he will run as the president who said, I kept you out of the war so far. Vote for me. I promise we'll keep out of the war. Didn't happen, mostly because of what happened here. That is it right down there, the Zimmermann telegram. It was discovered by the British, actually, and the British were able to, with their brilliant mathematicians in World War I, decipher its meaning. Yes, they were able to crack the code that you see right there. It was a communication from Germany to Mexico, intercepted by England, and they couldn't believe what they read. It took them a couple of weeks. Well, we couldn't believe, actually, what the British said it said. And so we had to turn it over to our own investigators to take a look at it. And it took a couple of weeks for them to say, yeah,
they're right, and it does say what the British says it says. And what does it say? Well, what it says is that we, Germany, if you, Mexico, join the war and fight the United States needs to be attacked in order for us to win the war. We will be victorious. You, Mexico, will be victorious as well because we'll help you out. We'll give you some weapons. You just attack the United States. They need a war front so that we can keep them diverted. Further, if you attack the United States, when our victory is all glorious and said and done, you will get back New Mexico and Arizona and parts of California and Texas. That'll have to be the terms of the peace. So just sign right here on the dotted line and we'll get going. Given Mexican politics at the time, and given our past history with Pancho Villa, who attacked New Mexico back in 1914 or 1913, somewhere in there, this seemed very plausible to us, to the United States. The government of Mexico will confirm that they did receive this message and that they understood it. And the problem with Germany was they miscalculated. If they had sent this message when Francisco Pancho Villa was in Mexico City and held it for a few months, they might have gotten a positive reply. But Carranza was in charge of Mexico City when the telegram came in. Look, Mexico is weak. They've been fighting for years this revolution. The idea of winning back Arizona and New Mexico and the deserts of California and Texas, they could scarcely keep control of their own as it was. Add more territory to it. It was a huge miscalculation by the Germans. So let's talk about some of the propaganda that comes out, because it's important. Both Hitler and Goebbels, those are World War II guys, they were students of U.S. World War propaganda. Joseph Goebbels made a statement once, and I think he's actually correct in this statement, that Germany lost this war mostly because of the propaganda levied against it. Propaganda that you see here, where Germany holding the club of culture, German social Darwinistic ways, but then he looks like an ape, right? Destroyed city in the background, heading up to the shores of America. He's already taken captive this beautiful European lady, and now he's ready to come in and bash heads here in America. These were very powerful symbols. Hundreds of pieces of propaganda from the American Center of Public of Information just flourished. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands and thousands, cities after cities. Millions of boys from the United States rushed to their recruiter's office to join a war in which they knew already a few million had already perished. They knew when American boys signed up to become soldiers and sailors that there was such a thing as mustard gas and grenades and tanks and machine guns and big giant howitzers raining death from above. One of the other songs I have queued up for you to listen to is a song written by Mr. Cohen called Over There. Very famous song. Once you hear it, you'll go, oh yeah, I know that song. It's still fresh in the memory of America. A great song that got people to line up to the recruiter's office. Many a night, boys drinking in the bars, listening to that song, and then next thing you know, the next morning with a hangover, there they are in the recruiter's office, ready to give their lives. George Creel, again, part of the CPI. Great story, him. One of the other things that happens during World War I is a huge transportation shift, or a huge migration of people, particularly African Americans, moving around to where there's work. And of course that means the industrialized North. I want to pick on Chicago here. Black population of Chicago in 1910, 44,000. Black population of Chicago in 1920, holy moly, 109,000 plus. An increase of 148%. Look at Detroit, 5,700 to 40,800, 611% increase. Philadelphia, New York had the largest populations of African Americans before the war. They will maintain that after the war. All of them increasing tremendously as Southerners begin to leave the South in droves. What's really incredible is this. In 1918, one of the most decorated infantry units in all of the First World War happens to be an African American infantry unit. But when African American veterans come back from the war, well, let's just say it's not pretty. After the war, I want to talk about some end-of-war patterns. Just like there were striking patterns, there's end-of-the-war patterns. Food prices will plummet. Farmers are going to find themselves in debt. Why is that? Well, mostly because farmers were making money hands over fist. They could make more money if the war just keeps going. So they borrow from banks money to buy tractor equipment, better fertilizer, more seeds, increase yields, increase productions, make more money. What they ended up doing was putting themselves in debt when the war came to a screeching halt. Factories will close. You no longer need to make the weapons of war. So no more bullets, no more tanks, no more guns, no more machine guns. Time to close all that down. And so you're going to have hundreds of thousands of workers out of work. Add that to the hundreds of thousands of veterans coming back from the war. This is a typical pattern that you will have a recession once the war returns, because you have so many people unemployed, they don't have money. Prices are determined by supply and demand. People with no money, then prices drop, see. The second part of this, though, is that poster over there we see came out of the New York Times. The steel strikes of 1919 were deadly, horrid, beastly things. Almost as bad as the Ludlow strikes. A lot of deaths. In the same pattern. Sheriff can't hold it. In go private cops. They couldn't deal with it. In go the National Guard. They couldn't deal with it. It finally took President and an order to send in the Marines to bring order to the steel strikes, by the way, in Chicago. The National Association of Manufacturers will do a terrific job of creating propaganda that paint the labor industry as something less than American. In fact, labor people are associated with communism. And this will come not just from the National Association of Manufacturers, but it will come from almost every group. Every industry leader will join forces with the National Association of Manufacturers to put out propaganda against labor. And the Palmer raids will begin. We're red baiting those unions, ladies and gentlemen. So I really would enjoy that you guys review in your book Mr. A. Mitchell Palmer and his raids. In the year 1919, right after the 4 million workers on strike, trying to keep their jobs, trying to keep a decent wage. But what happens is the strikes become so violent and the propaganda levied against them so effusive that middle class America begins to turn its back on labor. The Chicago riot of 1919 occurs at this point in time. And if you recall back, Chicago had already a significant number of African Americans living there, And during World War I, there were a significant number of jobs available and hardly enough workers to fill them. So African Americans who knew somebody up in Chicago would go to Chicago to get a job in one of the steel factories that actually went on strike in 1919. The problem with this is that the African American community was not so much restricted as to where they could stay, but they had to stay in kind of the low rent district. They weren't getting paid a whole heck of a lot. So it was mostly on the south side of Chicago, where there was already enough tension between different ethnicities, particularly the Irish. The Irish is the other source of cheap labor for America, and Irish look to the African Americans as the other source of cheap labor. Now, who's going to be cheaper, me or them? Who's going to get the job, me or them? My livelihood is at stake. So tensions between Irish Americans and African Americans are very, very high in the south of Chicago. There are other ethnic enclaves in the south side of Chicago at this time. In July of 1919, and here's the thing that you need to know about Chicago, there is no segregation in Chicago at this time. Neighborhoods sort of self-segregate, but there's no, like it is in the South, government-enforced segregation. Now there's this invisible line on the beach, Lake Michigan, I believe it is, in the south side of Chicago. And a young boy, African-American boy, drifts with the current across this mythical line that's drawn in the water. Can't draw a line in the water. So he's attacked, this boy, with rocks. And he's knocked unconscious, and he sinks, and he drowns. There's an instant fight on the beach. It spills over into the neighborhood in Chicago. Dozens will lose their lives. Property is attacked. Buildings will be burned. And this is against the backdrop, again, of folks like W.E. Du Bois, who argued that African Americans are just as patriotic as anybody else, that we have fought on the side of the United States, that we fought the Kaiser, that we have defeated Imperial Germany. We should have earned our freedom by now at this point. It didn't happen. What I'm telling you is that World War I involved us globally in a huge war. And it would take the United States to tip the balance of that war in the favor of France and Britain. Germany will lose. At the end of that war, Woodrow Wilson, president, will attempt to create a Treaty of Versailles and create a League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, to ensure that a war that is this destructive never happens again. But as he's campaigning around the world in order to put pressure on the Senate to pass this, because the Senate must ratify any treaty that a president signs, in October of 1919, while campaigning across the country, President Woodrow Wilson suffers a stroke. Then in November of 1919, and then again in March of 1920, the Senate will say no. Thank you to the Treaty of Versailles, no to the League of Nations. In the elections of 1920, Warren Harding beats James Cox, senator from Ohio, basically with this saying, we need a return to normalcy. The war, the strikes, the need for peace, to pull ourselves out of foreign entanglements, will put the Republicans back in power, will put the progressives to rest. And that's all I have for today. We'll see you next time.